My name is Nadine Caldwell, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a pharmacy technician at the same Walgreens on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. 31 years behind that counter, counting pills, reading prescriptions, watching the neighborhood change around me like weather. When my husband Harold passed April, 3 years ago now, a Tuesday morning, which somehow made it worse, just an ordinary Tuesday, I had two choices. I could sit in that house and let the quiet eat me alive, or I could keep moving. I kept moving. The overnight shift opened up 2 months after the funeral, 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Most people wouldn't want it. I signed up the same afternoon they posted the notice. My daughter called me 3 times that week, trying to talk me out of it. "Mama, you're 63 years old. You don't have to do this." I told her I knew exactly how old I was. And I told her what I didn't say out loud, that the daytime hours were the hardest. Too much light. Too much quiet. Too much space where Harold used to be. So I worked nights. The bus stopped running at midnight in my part of Germantown, and my car had been sitting in the driveway since October, when the transmission gave out, and I kept finding reasons not to fix it. I started calling cabs, old habit from before Uber. There was a dispatch company I'd used for years, and they sent whoever was available. For the first 2 weeks, it was a different driver every night. Then, one Thursday in November, a man named Walter showed up in a gray Chevy Impala, and he showed up again the next night, and the night after that. He was quiet. 60s, I guessed. Heavy-set, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead even when he wasn't reading anything. He kept a small fan clipped to his dashboard because, he told me once, the car's AC had been broken since August and he hadn't gotten around to it. I liked him immediately. He reminded me of the men I grew up around. Steady, didn't talk unless he had something to say. The first time I brought him coffee, it was purely practical. I'd made a full pot at work around 4 in the morning, and there was half a thermos left when my shift ended. I offered him some before I even thought about it. He accepted without making a big deal of it, poured it into the lid of his own thermos, drank it while we waited at a red light. "That's good coffee," he said. That was all. But something in the way he said it, like I'd done something that mattered, made me bring it again the next night. It became a routine. Every morning when I made the work pot at 4, I'd fill a small thermos I started keeping in my locker. 2 sugars, no cream, because after the 3rd night I'd noticed he took it that way. He never asked. I just paid attention. That's something Harold always said about me, that I noticed things other people walk right past. Walter noticed things too. He noticed when I was tired, and he'd turn the radio off without me asking. He noticed when I seemed upset, and he didn't pry, just kept his eyes on the road and gave me the silence I needed. He noticed the neighborhood around my house, the rhythm of it, who came and went, what time the lights went on and off in the houses on my block. I didn't know then that his noticing would end up being the most important thing in my life. I live on Ardmore Terrace, a row of older twins. Nice block. Mostly people who'd been there 15, 20 years. My neighbor 2 doors down, a man named Craig, mid-40s, recently moved in about 8 months before all this happened, had always struck me as off. Not dangerous, just off. He smiled too long when he waved. He asked questions that weren't quite neighborly. How long had I lived there? Whether I had family nearby, whether anyone stayed with me since my husband passed. I answered vaguely and went inside, and I told myself I was being an anxious old woman. I mentioned him to my daughter once. She said he was probably just awkward, probably lonely. I didn't bring it up again. What I didn't know, what none of us on the block knew, was that Craig had been cycling through neighborhoods for about 2 years. He'd do odd jobs, yard work, hauling, small repairs. He targeted older women living alone, Widows mostly. He'd build a surface-level friendliness, then start borrowing. Small things first. A ladder, a bag of rock salt for the steps. Then he'd ask about finances, whether you had someone managing things for you, whether you'd thought about updating your will. He was not a violent man. From what I later understood, he was something in some ways harder to see coming. He was patient, and he was deliberate, and he understood loneliness. He had been watching me for 2 months before Walter said anything. It was a Wednesday in February, the coldest week of the year, and I remember because the windshield kept fogging up, and Walter was wiping it with a cloth he kept tucked in the door. We were 4 blocks from my house when he turned down the radio. "Miss Nadine," he said. He always called me Miss Nadine. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." I turned to look at him. "There's a man who stands on your block when I drop you off," he said. "Not every night, but most nights this past month. He stands near the corner or sometimes near that blue truck across from your house. He watches you walk to your door. He waits until your light comes on. Then he leaves." The heat was running, but I felt cold. "What does he look like?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Walter described him. Stocky, dark jacket, sometimes a gray knit cap. "Craig." I didn't say the name out loud right away. I just sat with it, the way you sit with something you were hoping someone would tell you was nothing. "I wasn't sure at first," Walter said. "I thought maybe he was just out walking, but it's been too many times, and he always seems to be waiting for us to pull up, like he knows your schedule." He did know my schedule. I had told him back in December, making what I thought was small talk at the mailbox, that I worked overnight, that I got home around 7:30 most mornings, that I lived alone. I am not a person who panics. 31 years in a pharmacy, you learn to stay level. But sitting in that car, hearing Walter lay out what he had been watching without ever saying a word to me, without ever wanting anything for having noticed, something shifted in my chest that I couldn't quite name. "What should I do?" I asked, which was not a question I asked often. He said, "Tonight, don't go straight in. Come back to the car and say you forgot something. Let me park down the block for a few minutes. Let's see if he shows up." So we did. I got out, walked to my door, faked searching my bag, turned around and came back. Walter had pulled around and parked under the broken street light on the corner, lights off. We waited 11 minutes. Craig came around from the side street. He walked slow, hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped in front of my house and looked up at the dark windows. Stood there for a minute and a half. Then he walked back the way he came. I watched him, and I thought about every conversation we'd had. I thought about the questions he'd asked. I thought about the afternoon 3 weeks before when I'd come home on my day off and found him on my porch. And he'd said he thought he saw a problem with one of my steps and just wanted to check. I'd thanked him. I had thanked him. The next morning I called my daughter. I told her everything. She drove up from Wilmington that same afternoon. She wanted to call the police immediately. I wasn't sure, what did we have really? A man standing on a public street? Walter was the one who said we needed to think carefully. He didn't say it to me directly. He said it to my daughter when she asked if he'd be willing to talk to someone. He said he would. And he said that what mattered wasn't just Craig, but what Craig was actually planning, because without that we couldn't do much. "People like that," he said quietly, over the hood of his car in my driveway. "They don't just disappear because you stare back at them. They find a different angle." My daughter looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at me. That evening, we found a number for a local detective agency, my daughter's idea, through a friend of hers who'd used them for a background check on a contractor. It felt dramatic. It felt like something out of a television movie. It turned out to be exactly right. Over the course of 3 weeks, the agency looked into Craig. What they found was not good, but it also was not surprising. He'd had a civil judgment filed against him in Montgomery County, an elderly woman who'd accused him of pressuring her into signing documents that redirected money from her savings account. The case had been settled out of court. He'd moved twice since then. He had no criminal record, but the pattern was clean and documented once you looked. The detective agency helped us put together a file. My daughter hired an elder law attorney, which I told her was unnecessary, and she told me it absolutely was, and she was right. The attorney sent Craig a formal letter, something precise and legal about documented surveillance, about witnesses, about the civil record in Montgomery County. I don't know exactly what it said, but Craig was gone before the end of the month. Moved out of the house on Ardmore Terrace so fast the landlord told my next-door neighbor he'd left half his furniture behind. I still think about that sometimes. All those mornings I walked past his house without knowing. All those evenings I was polite at the mailbox and gave him exactly what he needed, information about my life, my schedule, my aloneness. But I think more about Walter. He drove me home for 5 months before he said a word about any of it. He never asked for anything extra. He never made it about himself. When my daughter offered to pay him for the nights he'd sat and watched after dropping me off, because it turned out he'd done that several times, just to be sure, he refused. He shook his head like the idea embarrassed him. "You brought me coffee," he said, "every morning without me asking." He said it like that was explanation enough. I found out about his son almost by accident. One morning in March, after everything with Craig had been resolved, I was in the car and Walter's phone buzzed on the console. He glanced at it and then looked away, and his whole face changed. Closed down the way faces do when something hurts, and you've trained yourself not to show it. I didn't ask, but I filed it away. 2 weeks later, near the end of a quiet ride, I said, "You have a son." He looked at me in the rearview mirror. "How'd you know that?" "You looked at your phone one morning like it might be him, and it wasn't." He was quiet for almost a full minute. "He's in Atlanta," he said finally. "We haven't spoken in 4 years." A pause. "His mother and I split when he was 17. He blamed me. He was right to, partly. I made choices I can't walk back." "Have you tried?" "Twice. Both times he didn't answer." I thought about that for a few days. Then I wrote a letter. Not for Walter. I had no right to do that. I wrote it for myself, really, the way you write things you can't quite say out loud. I wrote about what it means to have someone show up for you without being asked. I wrote about how sometimes people change and how sometimes they don't know you're looking until someone tells them. I gave it to Walter and told him to read it and decide what to do with it. He called me 2 days later, not from the car, from his home, which felt significant. He said he'd read it 4 times. He said he'd used parts of it as a starting point for a letter to his son. I told him that was his letter, not mine, that it counted. His son called him 6 weeks after that. It was a short call, Walter said. Careful on both sides, but it was a call. I'm not saying a cup of coffee and a thermos every morning fixes things. I'm not that naive. But I think about what Walter said. You brought me coffee without me asking. And I think the thing he was really saying was, you saw me. Not the uniform, not the service, not the transaction. You saw that I was a person who was tired and cold and driving through the dark at 7 a.m, and you thought to bring something warm. That kind of scene goes places you can't track. It lands somewhere you don't always get to witness. I fixed my car in May. The transmission cost me more than I wanted to spend, and my daughter said, "Good, now please stop working nights," and I said I'd think about it. I still take the overnight shift twice a week. Not because I have to anymore, because there is something about that particular silence. The pharmacy at 4 a.m, the city resting, the long warm hours before the sun comes up, that I have come to love. Walter and I still talk. He gave me his number after everything, said if I ever need a ride to call, not the dispatch, just him directly. I've called 3 times. Once when my daughter's car broke down and I needed to pick her up from the train station. Once when I had a medical appointment and I didn't want to sit in a waiting room and then navigate the bus home alone. Once just to have coffee at the diner on Broad Street and sit with someone who knew what had happened and didn't need me to explain any of it. His son came up to Philadelphia in June, just for the weekend. Walter mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, quietly, like he was still deciding how much to trust good news. But he smiled when he said it. A full smile, not the careful kind. I thought about Harold, about how he used to say I noticed things other people walked past. I used to think he meant I was observant in a practical way, a pharmacy brain, always checking, always cataloging. But sitting with Walter that afternoon in the diner, watching him talk about his son with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, I thought maybe Harold meant something gentler than that. Maybe he meant that I saw people, that I paid the kind of attention that made people feel less invisible, that it was worth something, that it always had been. Be kind, not because it guarantees safety, not because the world will always reward you for it. Be kind because when you see someone as a person and treat them accordingly, you are both changed by it. You can't always know how. You can't always trace the line from the thermos of coffee to the late-night warning to the letter that crossed state lines and brought a father and son back into the same room. But the line is there. It was always there. I think about that thermos a lot. A small blue one I bought at Walgreens for $8.99, the kind with the rubber grip around the middle. I filled it every morning at 4 a.m. because there was coffee left and someone else was awake in the cold and it seemed like the right thing to do. I didn't think of it as kindness. I thought of it as basic human decency, the same thing my mother called acting right. But here is what I've come to understand, looking back at everything that happened on Ardmore Terrace, the way we treat people in small, unwitnessed moments builds something. It builds trust. It builds attention. It builds the kind of relationship where a man feels responsible enough to say, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear me out. Walter didn't have to say anything. He could have dropped me off and driven away and told himself it wasn't his business. Most people would have. Instead, he had been quietly watching for weeks, logging what he saw, waiting until he was sure enough to speak. That is not just a good heart. That is a disciplined mind, the kind that observes without assuming, that waits for evidence before acting, that thinks before it speaks. I had not given him that quality. He already had it, but I think the coffee told him I was worth using it for. Craig counted on the opposite. He counted on loneliness making people careless. He counted on widows being too grateful for attention to question the motives behind it. And for a while, I almost was. I answered his questions at the mailbox. I thanked him for checking my steps. I told myself I was being charitable and open-minded, when really I was ignoring something my gut had been saying for months. That is a hard thing to admit, that I had the instinct and I talked myself out of it, because I didn't want to seem like a suspicious old woman. What Walter gave me, beyond the warning, was permission to trust my own perception again. He saw what I had been dismissing, and he named it plainly. That mattered more than I can say. And then there was his son. 4 years of silence, 2 unanswered calls. I think about what it takes to keep trying after that, to not harden, to not decide the door is permanently closed. Walter had kept something open in himself despite everything, and when the right moment came, he stepped through it. That kind of persistence, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, is one of the strongest things I know. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband and worked 31 years in a job that required me to be precise and careful and steady every single day. I know something about showing up. But this experience reminded me that showing up for strangers, for the man in the gray Impala at 7 in the morning, for the neighbor you don't know well, for the person standing in the cold, is where character actually lives. Not in the big moments, in the small ones, in the $8.99 thermos, in the 2 sugars, no cream because you paid attention. What you put into the world finds its way back. Not always quickly, not always in the form you expect. But the line is there if you're willing to trace it. I'm willing.